Precious name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Today, we are looking at the things that Jesus said, part 27. I thought we preached a really long series last year, but we've completely eclipsed that one. And as we've looked at the things that Jesus said this year, there has been a number of things that have come through that have been quite loud and clear, one of them being the price that we have to pay when we choose to follow Jesus. Now, the truth is that everything in life costs you. There's a price to pay for every day you're alive on the planet. Every decision you make either costs you now or into the future. You may have heard the quote, you can pay the price of discipline now or the price of regret later, you choose. It points to the fact that there is always a cost that must be paid and will be paid for every action that we take. When we choose to engage with Jesus' commands, there's a cost. But don't be fooled, there's also a cost that you'll pay if you don't engage with his commands. You can choose to live a selfish life, pursuing self-gratification, or you can choose to live a life focused on dying to self and loving others. Which one of those do you think will require more from you initially? Which one of those ends up benefiting you more in the long run? Now, neither of them will insulate you from suffering. But if you're wise, you'll put your effort into the side of the ledger with the best returns for your effort. Now, some people try to straddle both sides of the fence, but eventually you come to a point where you have to commit to one side or the other, lest you be ripped in half. It's a little bit like trying to climb two ladders leaning in opposite directions at the same time. Eventually you're going to have to commit to one side or the other. And it's at that point that many people fall away from Jesus because they've allowed themselves to get too invested in the self side of the equation rather than the Jesus side. It's easier to make the decision to follow the way of Jesus when you're not heavily involved in the wrong side of the equation. It's why in the Beatitudes that Jesus says that the poor, those who mourn, the badly treated, and the ones who are persecuted by the powerful are blessed. Now, they're not blessed because of what's happening to them. They're blessed because when you have little in the way of possessions, power, or prestige, it's easier to lean toward God and avoid the trap of self. Now, you can't read through the Gospels without coming to the realization that to follow Jesus requires a commitment to take our allegiance to him all the way to the grave, if necessary. As Robert Ferguson puts it, I am up there, I'm just not on the screen down here. As Robert Ferguson puts it, in our modern world, it's becoming more difficult to live a life of faith and conviction. Critics question our rationality, certainty, and beliefs. In some places, persecution is on the increase. And as a result, many are choosing compromise over conviction and comfort over calling. Now, of course, this isn't a new phenomenon. People have abandoned the faith and chosen an easier path from the time of Jesus through to our day. For example, when Jesus offended his listeners in Capernaum by asking them to eat his flesh and drink his blood, his followers found the teaching too hard and chose to leave. The Bible says from this time on, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. And no doubt they came up with excuses, as we always do. It's too difficult. I have other priorities. I prefer to go my own way. I like the miracles, but not the message. I don't like the other disciples. And at this point, Jesus turned to his remaining followers and he asked them, you don't want to leave me too, do you? It's a question we all need to think about, especially if we're being tempted to draw back. Peter's response should be ours. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. So as we head into the end of the year, and a possible conclusion of this series. I'm actually tempted to do it over 2 years, maybe even 3 years. Jesus lived for 3 years, so he didn't live for 3 years. He lived a lot longer than that. But I think he had 3 years of ministry, so we could talk about the things Jesus said for 3 years. I mean, I think that would be pretty good. But as we head toward the end of the year, I want to spend these last few weeks not looking necessarily at the cost, but rather at the benefits we receive when we're prepared to pay the price of following Jesus. Because it's not all doom and gloom. And specifically, I want to look at peace, provision, protection and purpose. And yes, they all start with the letter P, and no, we may not get through them all by the end of the year. But today, we're going to focus on the peace that Jesus promises us. Now, a few months ago, at one of our One Community Together work and learning meetings that I was chairing at the Grace Centre, we had with us a lady who's been employed by Bayview College to work with kids who struggled to get to school. And I asked her during that meeting, what was the number one reason that kids weren't attending? And she surprised me with her answer. She said the number one reason the kids weren't going to school was because of anxiety. Now, some of you have been around for a fair long time, and I'm pretty certain when you remember back to your days at school, anxiety probably wasn't the reason that kids didn't turn up. There were other reasons. But she said anxiety is the number one reason why young people are wagging school today. In an article published in the Journal of Psychosomatic Research in October of 2019, the researchers said this: anxiety disorders accounted for the largest proportion of total treatment costs of high prevalence mental disorders in Australia, with an annual health sector cost of $376 million. Total annual productivity loss attributable to anxiety disorders. So these are the adults, not the kids. These are the adults, right, who don't turn up for work. The total annual productivity loss attributable to anxiety disorders has been estimated at nearly $5 billion per annum. Now, we can look at the world around us and say, well, that's all happening out there. But it's actually happening in here as well. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that a magic wand gets waved over your life and you get to drift through the rest of your life on cloud 9 with no anxiety or worry whatsoever. That's totally unrealistic. However, if you're willing to pay the price to follow Jesus, you can have far more peace in your life than you're currently experiencing. And this morning, I want to show you how that can be possible. In John 14, Jesus promises his disciples peace. He said this. He said, "I'm leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid." Which begs the question, what type of peace does the world offer us, and how do most people find it? Now, the type of peace that the world offers us is situational peace. And most often, it's found through the accumulation of power, possessions, and prestige, which insulate us, supposedly, from the negative aspects of life. They try to control their lives, and if they can't, they often revert to substances that can give them a temporary break from their current reality. Jesus said that he had a peace to give us that we can't get from the world, using the strategies that others use. It's a peace that guards our minds and our hearts, our thinking and our emotions. It's a real, genuine peace. A peace that's not dependent on being in control or having enough money to buy yourself out of whatever situation you might find yourself in. It's not dependent on being considered important and having power to get your own way, or having access to enough alcohol or drugs to make everything a little bit more bearable. It's a peace that only he can give. In John 16, we find Jesus promising his disciples peace once again. And this all happened in the same conversation, a conversation that took place the night he was betrayed. It was his last night with his disciples before his crucifixion the next day. And in John 16:33 we read, "I've told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I've overcome the world." Now I find this statement of Jesus in the context of his imminent death, because he knew he was about to die, quite strange. He's about to be killed, and he's telling his disciples to take heart because he's overcome the world. And yet in a few short hours they were going to see him being put to death in front of their eyes. And at that point, on the surface at least, he most certainly wasn't overcoming anyone, let alone the world. And then they were going to have to wait for 3 days, thinking that he was dead, and everything they dreamed of and placed their hope in for the last 3 years was dead as well, before they saw him resurrected and alive again. Have you ever wondered why Jesus took 3 days to come back from the dead? Why didn't he rise the very next day? Why did he let his disciples stew in their grief for 3 days before letting them know that he'd overcome the last and greatest enemy of all humanity, death and the grave? Now, I don't believe God makes mistakes. I think he had every minute planned, right down to the last second of the time span, that he knew it would take to change, for change to happen within the heart and mind of his disciples. I believe that suffering, because believe you me, they would have suffered during those 3 days and nights, has the power to change the way we see the truth. Suffering takes away from us the ability to pretend that everything is okay, that we're in control. It's only when we stare into the face of truth that we can be fully free. The disciples stared into the face of death for 3 days and 3 nights and fully experienced their grief at the loss of Jesus. They were powerless to turn the events around and roll back time. And I'm sure they would have been thinking about all the things that they could have done differently that would have kept Jesus alive. But hindsight is a cruel teacher at the best of times. And then as their grief peaked and the youthful optimism bottomed out, Jesus comes back from the dead and they see him alive once again. Can you imagine what that would have been like? Can you imagine what that did to their psyche, to their mental state, to their view of the world? They went from being in a situation where they felt like the light had been extinguished and only darkness was in their future, to being completely and utterly lifted up to the highest mountaintop possible. They believed in Jesus before his crucifixion, but now their confidence and trust in him took them to a place that they'd never been. This was the gift that Jesus was talking about, that he said he was giving to them. The gift of peace. Being able to see a truth that was more powerful than the strongest enemy that any of us will ever face, our own death. A truth that would bring such a sense of peace that no circumstance or situation would ever be able to shake it. Now, trials, sorrows and disappointments were still their lot in the years ahead. Jesus had warned them about that, but they had an underlying peace that their circumstances would never be able to shift because they had seen through the veil. And because they had seen through the veil and knew beyond a shadow of doubt that Jesus had already overcome the world, and if they remained loyal to him, they would as well. So fast forward 2,000 years, and here we are, reading the words of Jesus, where he's promised us this gift of peace. but was still anxious, afraid, worried, and caught up with the pursuit of material comfort at the expense of our health, our relationships, and even our eternity. And why is that? Why is that? There's a battle going on for your soul, and you're the gatekeeper. You choose who wins. There will be trials and sorrow, but if you're willing to pay the price of following Jesus, you can overcome anything the world throws at you as you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith. If you're not experiencing peace, now this might sound a little bit tough, but I want you just to hang with me for a moment. If you're not experiencing peace, it's because you've chosen to limit your thinking. You're not looking at Jesus and thinking through the implications of what it is that you believe. You're not paying attention, and because of that you're suffering more than you should. Leo Tolstoy, a famous Russian author, wrote a little booklet called Confessions, telling how at around the age of 50 he had an existential crisis. He didn't have much of a faith in anything. He was part of the Russian intelligentsia. The Soviet Union had this stance about God. They said God's dead. They were the national religion of their country was atheism. He was already a pretty well-known writer at that stage, and he asked his friends, what happens when you die? And you know what his friends told him? They said, well, when you die, you just don't exist anymore. His group of friends were convinced that there was no God, and that when you die, you just stop existing, and eventually the sun will burn out and everything will end. But Tolstoy pushed back against that, saying, wait a minute, if that's the case, if that's the truth, why go on? Why should I keep writing books? Everything's meaningless. Because if what you're saying is true, it means that in the end it doesn't matter what I do. Nobody's going to be around to know. It doesn't matter whether I'm cruel or whether I'm good, because in the end nothing I do makes any difference. Everything's meaningless. Why even go on? And you know what his friends said to him? You know what their response back was? They said, hey, just go to the beach. Go shopping. You're a Russian artist. You're morbid. You know, Russian artists are like that. And so you're thinking too much. You need to just enjoy life and not think. And here's what Tolstoy said. And he actually said this is why he started moving back toward Christianity. He said, what kind of view of the world is only livable if you don't think about what you believe? What type of view of the world is only livable if I don't think about the implications of what I believe about the world? In other words, the world's peace comes from not thinking too much about what they actually believe about the world. But Jesus tells us the opposite when he says peace comes from him. If you're a Christian here today and you don't have a lot of peace in your heart, do you know why? It's because you're not thinking enough. You're not thinking out the implications of what it is that you believe. As Tim Keller says, the world's peace is a stupid peace. And you can only have it if you don't think through the implications of what you believe. But the Christian peace is an intelligent peace, and it grows as you think through the implications of what you believe. When Jesus said he was leaving his disciples with his peace, he then said that they would experience trials and sorrow in life. And for the next 3 days, that's exactly what they experienced. And just as their grief peaked and their hope bottomed out into the darkness of their pain, Jesus came back from the dead, alive and well, showing them that he had truly overcome the world as he said he had, and because that's what they now believed, his peace became their constant companion. Because peace is the gift you receive when you believe that Jesus is who he said he is, and that he has overcome the world, which he proved when he rose from the dead. And that gift of peace can be yours as well if you'll simply take the time to think through the implications of what you believe about Jesus, what you believe about God, what you think Jesus thinks about you. You'll be tempted to look at your bank balance. You'll be tempted to look for approval on the faces of others. You'll be tempted to try and control the people around you and the situation you're facing when you feel your peace slipping away. But you need to learn to discipline yourself and bring yourself back to the feet of Jesus and engage with the truth of what you believe about him. Because God created the world in love. It was meant to be a place of life, of peace and joy, of kindness and shalom. But humanity placed our selfish interest ahead of love, and sin and decay and death ripped the world off the path that God had set it on. God saw all of that take place. And because he loved us so much, he implemented a plan to rescue us. And Jesus entered the world as a baby, grew up amongst those he had created, and then paid the ultimate price for our forgiveness so that we could be restored back in a relationship with him. He was crucified, and then 3 days later he came back from the grave. If Jesus loved you enough to die for you, how much more will he help you when you're faced with difficulties, with setbacks, with persecution? This is the truth that your belief will lead you to, and that truth will gift you a peace that the world can't take away. It's not magic. You don't receive the peace of God by somebody waving a magic wand over your head. The peace that Jesus left us was a peace that's based on the truth about life. And it's there for every single one of us, not just those that might have a special connection with Jesus. It's there for every single one of us who will actually engage with the words that Jesus spoke. We'll actually engage with the truth that we find within the pages of our Bibles, and we'll follow through the belief that they have in God to its ultimate conclusion, which is this: that everything is going to be okay. That the future's going to be okay. That you will be okay. And I think sometimes when we're going through situations or circumstances that are out of our control, and we can't control them or manage them, and things are happening and other people are doing things and you're dependent upon other things lining up and you've got no control there, the thing that you want to know is that ultimately everything's going to be okay. And the implications of your faith in Jesus, if you believe in Jesus, if you believe that he is who he said he was, the Son of God, proven by his death and his resurrection from the dead, you believe that, then you can have faith. You can have peace in the midst of whatever circumstance or situation that you're going through. Now, if at the moment you're feeling stressed because of a financial struggle, if you're anxious because someone doesn't like you, if you're worried because others aren't giving you the respect you think you deserve, if you're fearful because you're facing a situation that you have no control over, that's dependent on factors outside of your influence, then come and sit at the feet of Jesus and engage with his truth. Let the implications of what he said and did bring peace to your situation. Doesn't matter what you're facing in life. If you have paid the price of following Jesus, if you are each day taking up your cross to follow him, if you've put him as Lord of your life, then everything is going to be okay. It's going to work out. This life, if you haven't noticed, is pretty messed up at times. And I've talked to some people and I've listened to their stories, and I think sometimes, how on earth do they even get out of bed in the morning? Life can be quite tragic. Life can just send us into a tailspin when we're least expecting it. Stuff happens to people. People die unexpectedly. People end up with diseases and illnesses and sicknesses that they never deserve. They weren't looking for it. People have relationships that go pear-shaped. Sometimes the stuff that we do ends up catching up with us, and there's nothing that we can do about it except somehow get through to the other side. And this is where knowing the truth about Jesus can bring peace into our lives. If you believe in Jesus, your future is assured. Your eternity is assured. Doesn't matter what people do to you. Doesn't matter what people say. Doesn't matter what happens to you. Doesn't matter if you don't end up living in the house of your dreams or having the job that you always thought you should have. It doesn't matter if your relationships fall apart. Now, when I say it doesn't matter, you will feel them. They're called trials and sorrows. You're going to cop them. They're going to be there for you. I mean, Jesus promised us trials and sorrows. Thanks, Jesus. But you can have a peace in the midst of it all, knowing that it's going to be okay. I am leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid. I've told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome